Welcome to the podcast dedicated to making you a faster cyclist, the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm joined by a special guest today. We have Dr. Tim Podlogar from the University of Birmingham, and also does like some really cool stuff outside of that, what we're going to get into later in this podcast. But Tim, we've had you on the podcast before, I should say the Science of Getting Faster podcast. I'm excited to have you here where we can discuss all things nutrition, because that's really what you focus on. How are things going over in the UK?
Hey Jonathan, yeah, I'm excited to talk about sports nutrition because talking about the British weather is not exciting whatsoever.
Yeah, makes sense. You're from Slovenia, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. So before we go any further, because of what's going on right now in the cycling world with Tadej and his dominance in the Giro, did you know of Tadej before Tadej became, Tadej that we all know, like the pro cyclist and such a dominant guy? Did you know him before then?
Yeah, I heard about this guy because Slovenia is so small, there are 2 million people living there, his hometown is basically a few kilometers from where I'm from, and everyone knew about this young talent pretty much pretty quickly because he was winning everything in his young selections already.
Wow. So yeah, he's been that dominant from the beginning, huh?
Yeah.
I guess what do you think about Tadej? I mean, I'm sure you feel a lot of like pride, right? Having, like you said, a small country and having Tadej being so dominant. And then at the same time, your background is in sports nutrition and everything that goes in from a clinical perspective, even with that. So like, what are your thoughts on Tadej? Is he a generational talent that we're seeing here? And could he be like the best of all time? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's like a big talent. And for some reason in Slovenia, like we kind of get a lot of talents in different sports. So like I think Slovenia per number of people we usually like get the most Olympic medals. So it's in various sports that we have really good people. And like in cycling at the moment, we have Tadej and Primož kind of being on the top level. But for today, I think one of the things that is really nice in Slovenia is that the weather is good and kids are from young age encouraged to take part in sports, and sports become very competitive pretty early, so that like there are clubs that support the young athletes. Taking part in sports is not as expensive, and all the culture is kind of very encouraging for having kids that exercise. So I took part in many sports myself, have been like competitively sailing for years, and it's every kid pretty much does a sport. So I think it was just like about the time like when you kind of find a talent, and in this way pretty much everyone can take part in sports and you can probably hopefully find a talent. And I think he's very talented but also hardworking, and this is another thing that kind of from the cultural point of view makes sense, because people in Slovenia kind of are known to kind of work hard and really want to achieve something in their lives. And sport is just like something that is really important for people, and there is a lot of free time as well. So like when I was a kid, my parents didn't work 9 to 5, it was more like 7 to 3 or 4 o'clock. So in the afternoons, parents would take you to do sports, and like there is a lot of free time as probably compared to some more kind of Western countries like the States or the UK, and it's more kind of also approachable because everything is cheaper. The local councils support the clubs, so taking part in sports is much cheaper, and this is how you get more talents, I think. That's
interesting. Makes you want to go to Slovenia. Sounds amazing. Have you noticed anything that Tadej does uniquely? Like, I mean, obviously winning or leading the Giro by 6 minutes is quite unique, but is there anything in his process that and I know that you don't work directly with Tadej, you work with the Bora Hansgrohe team as an advisor on the sports nutrition side, but perhaps there's something that you know of or anything else that Tadej perhaps did as a younger athlete that was unique or still to this day? What makes him special?
I think he just enjoys winning and enjoys cycling. And I think like looking at the riders, like every single stage he wins. You can see how much he enjoys the moment and like every part of it. And even around like later after the stages when he talks to people, like you can see this excitement and this like pure joy. as compared to some other riders that are more like super focused and like somehow like more aggressive to the journalists, and he's just open and just enjoys it. So I think like he's a perfect rider, a perfect athlete for this sport to basically, because to build up on the image of the sport and get the popularity among people that are not familiar with cycling.
Yeah, it's so fun to watch him. Like there's that concept of the miserable champion, where it's, they're champion of the sport, but they're just miserable throughout the entire process. And he stands in direct opposition to that. He's a joyful champion, and he's enjoying it, and he loves it. There's passion there. You can feel it, and it makes cycling so much fun, and I'm sure that the rest of the riders that are racing against him don't find it too fun, having to put up with an athlete so strong. But at the same time, it's how can you dislike the guy? He loves what he's doing, and it's just awesome. So it's pretty cool. Go Slovenia. It's super exciting to see that. Tim, I want to talk to you. I have you on here today because I want to talk to you about what the things that you're learning, because like I mentioned just there, not only are you in the lab and you're doing experiments and you're constantly carrying out studies and you're learning, you're teaching, you're doing a lot of different things. You work at the Human Performance Center lab as well. So like you're testing different things. Just even out of curiosity, I see you testing a lot of stuff on Instagram, like being willing to test yourself even on some of this stuff. But you're testing a lot of stuff. And then on top of that, you're learning a lot of things in terms of the application, I'm sure, and how the World Tour works with Bora Hansgrohe. And let's keep just adding into all this context and awareness for people. You're also, you are a fast cyclist. And at one point, you were a very, very fast cyclist, very like elite level cyclist. So you have a lot of good context with this. And Tim, I think maybe the best spot to start here is I want to talk to you about like what things you're doing currently in your lab and what things you're working on, and maybe some things that you've seen that are cool learnings or something surprising. So what's the main thing that you're working on right now in terms of research?
So I'm pretty much finishing up my postdoc, a 3-year project at the University of Birmingham before I move to the next chapter. What we are doing is, it's a massive project, and what we're trying to figure out is what happens with ingested carbohydrates while you exercise in the heat and when you do heat acclimation. Because we know that like prevalence of gastrointestinal discomfort is much higher when you take part in exercise in the heat, be it humid environment or just hot weather. But also, we know that from old studies that in this scenario, the carbohydrate use will be higher, so you will be going through glycogen levels much quicker. And some studies from the past, I think it was 1 or 2, from actually Birmingham, from Asker Jochen group more than a decade ago, showed that the absorption or utilization of ingested carbohydrates goes down with the heat. And this is kind of really important because at one side, you get increased rates of degradation of glycogen, but on the other hand, you can't ingest more carbohydrates because the absorption is limiting you. And what we're trying to now better understand is whether with heat acclimation, which is kind of getting the body ready to exercise in the heat, you kind of overcome this limitation. So this is something like we are currently analyzing the data on, and we'll be trying to probably publish it in the next year or so. But cool. So I can't really talk about the result because I hope they first need to be peer reviewed. But it seems that like the absorption is still the limiting factor because all the blood goes to the muscle and to the skin. So you improve the thermal comfort, but still the blood is not going into the intestine. But that's just like a current guess, and might be something else going on, but we haven't got to analyze all the data yet. So this is something obviously very relevant for cyclists when we're talking about, and I mean, looking ahead to the Tour de France, we're going to have some really hot weather, I'm sure, and they're going to be dealing with that. But a question that I have with this is these athletes that are taking in, because we're seeing like pretty high levels of carbohydrate being taken in by athletes. When athletes, and perhaps you've observed this, but like what's the tipping point in terms of temperature? I guess that's the first question, is
Like what is too hot, or where do you start to see diminishing returns, or I guess should say effects, negative effects on how many carbs you can process and ingest without GI discomfort?
I think it's like a tough question and we don't really know the answer to, but my feeling is that it's not perhaps just the core temperature, but it's like, I think skin temperature that's kind of the most important factor, because the heat stress, it comes down to humidity, it comes down to the the radiation, it comes down to the wind speed, or basically the speed of the bicycle. So it's not the same if you're riding on a flat or going up the hill, because the wind speed or apparent wind will be different, and this can all influence everything. So you can't really say out loud like, oh, it's this temperature, this is what's gonna happen. But kind of looking at skin temperature, kind of I think gives you a pretty good idea of what's happening. So if you measure skin temperature at rest, it will be, I don't know, around 32 degrees, let's say it. And then when you start exercising in a well air-conditioned space, so I don't know, 18 degrees, 30% humidity, fans at full speed, and you do an interval, your skin temperature will drop from 32 degrees to 28 degrees to basically create a bigger gradient between the core and the skin. And in this case, the cooling works really well. And I remember when I was still a PhD student years ago, I had a rectal thermistor in just to check the temperature of the core while I was doing my 8-minute intervals, and the core temperature got to like 39.5 degrees, which is super high. And some would say like this is like heat stress, but I was feeling
dangerous, right?
But I was feeling just fine because the skin temperature was like only like 28, 29 degrees because I was cooling down normally. What happens in the heat chamber, in the heat, your skin temperature will basically get to 37 degrees or 38 degrees sometimes. So basically your core and the skin might be at the same temperature, so your whole body temperature is going to be really high. And this is when the body is really struggling to dissipate the heat because, well, there is no gradient, and the only way that you kind of increase the heat dissipation is to send more blood to the skin, maximize the sweat rates, so basically all other organs, because the temperature regulation is the most important thing at that moment because of the health, the intestines will not get probably any blood. So measuring, like getting a sense of skin temperature can be really good. And I remember I tried to do once a KOM attempt on a local climb in Slovenia, and I couldn't do it. And then I checked my skin temperature because I was wearing the sensor, and it was around 37 degrees. So I was like, okay, now I understand what was happening.
Interesting.
So this is kind of, I think, so the higher the skin temperature it is, the bigger the impact will be. This
is probably diverting a bit here and maybe out of your realm of expertise, but I would assume that this is why certain products would contain menthol that you would put on your skin. I've seen this, like, for example, I remember the sodium bicarbonate lotion, and you've done studies actually on sodium bicarbonate and everything else that we've covered on our podcast before, which is, they've been super insightful, but, sodium bicarbonate, I remember like the lotion that they had, it had menthol within it. And I was always wondering if it was that cooling effect that you got with menthol perhaps influenced that gradient that you have, that temperature gradient from core to skin temp, or does it not work that way?
I don't think menthol would do anything to cooling. It just basically you activate the receptors that will make your brain feel that it's cooler, whereas actually the effect would be the reverse. So it can actually be dangerous if you like tell the body, oh, it's not hot at all. You can continue going, and you might actually increase the body temperature to like really high values. I think,
so it kind of masks the reality.
Yeah, I think I was just thinking about like how you can cool down people quicker, and one of the things is like you can pour down, instead of water over your body, methanol or ethanol, like the alcohol, because it evaporates much quicker, so you get more dissipating energy out of it. But I don't know whether this would go well with the surrounding cars and
Well, that's actually something that I know that has been utilized in the cross-country Olympic world in terms of they have the drink bottles, and then they have the spray bottles where you intentionally grab a bottle just to spray your body off. And I have heard of, now whether I don't have any evidence of this, it's simply hearsay. However, I have heard that is utilized in cross country World Cup with certain athletes, that they use some sort of alcohol within that bottle to spray because it evaporates quicker on their bodies. You certainly wouldn't want to get your bottles mixed up. You'd want to make sure that, and that's probably the sort of bottle that you would spray and then drop and not even put on your bike, right? Because you would want to forget about it. But yeah, that's an interesting concept, and I've heard about. Nobody's had the guts to make that product yet, it seems, to go out and say spray alcohol all over your body and it'll work. It's an interesting concept. So, and the reason here, like you said, you're pulling blood away from the digestive process. And as a result, you can't take in as much carbohydrate or perhaps process the amount of carbohydrate, which then affects backstream up that intake and everything else. Is this something that you have seen isn't a problem if you don't take in a lot of carbohydrate, or is it more of a modern problem because athletes are taking in upwards of 90 grams of carbohydrate?
Yeah, because I don't know, like we spoke briefly about Tadej Pogacar earlier. And last year at Tour de France, during one of the stages, he was actually making this comment. It was too hot and the carbohydrates didn't go into the system and I was really struggling. And I was like, okay, yeah, perhaps you really need to think about adjusting your carbohydrate intake and going from 120 to perhaps, 90 grams per hour or something, because you basically can't absorb this much carbohydrates in these conditions. And it's the same with dehydration and thirst. Thirst is going to impair performance the most, and the same gastrointestinal discomfort will impair performance the most, because you don't want to have problems with the stomach and urge to have a diarrhea or whatever. So I think this is kind of really important thing to consider when you do plan for the nutrition.
Yeah, and this is something that I feel like it's going to become more of a problem for sure as amateur athletes are catching up to these higher intake rates for sure. Tim, is there something over the past couple of years, you've studied and you've looked into and investigated quite a lot of different things, and I'm sure you've even heard things from your peers, but what perspectives have changed over the last few years, or what thoughts did you have that you thought were absolutely the truth and then it changed as a result of things that you have seen either in the lab or from your colleagues or perhaps even working with pro teams?
I don't know, one of the things that probably is really important these days is keeping athletes in energy balance. And to keep athletes in energy balance, you have to start thinking how you're going to distribute the carbohydrate intake around it, whether you go more towards glycogen loading or you go more towards the nutrition on the bike. And when you make exceptions for a one-day race, you basically do both, whatever it takes. But this is something I think it's not completely clear yet what is more important, and I think we need to do more work in that area, especially for amateurs, because if you go professionals are eating 120 grams per hour and then you do a 2-hour ride indoors with 120 grams per hour and your power output is 180 watts on average, and you still eat normally throughout the day, you will never ever going to perhaps meet your goal of having energy deficit at the end of the week, because it's basically not burning this amount of carbs. So you have to start to think what is the most important time to have the carbohydrates. And then you can answer this question in different ways. You can perhaps increase the carbohydrate intake gradually over the duration of the race, which is probably what I think many professional riders are doing these days, or have less carbohydrates on certain days when you know that nothing major is going to happen, and then you're in energy surplus on the day of the race. But this is all the thinking perspectives that you need to take into account.
That brings me to another question I wanted to ask. While watching the Giro, they had Jonathan Vaughters of EF on the broadcast, and he was talking about the big new frontier, the big change for them has been looking into nutrient timing, or perhaps it was phrased in terms of periodization of carbohydrate intake. I can't remember if it was or not, but that's the concept basically, in saying that the big thing that we've changed that's hugely advantageous for this year. And granted, he's in a position to promote his team and everything else. So all those caveats out the door, but he said that was like the big change. Do you feel like that is indeed like a big change that's going on in the peloton now, in the sense that the timing of everything is where people are gaining an advantage, or are they still just trying to consume enough to be able to keep up with how much energy those athletes are consuming?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And like, I keep seeing on like social networks, oh, this is like revolutionary what you're doing these days. And like, the science has advanced so far that we are like on this point where like we prescribed every single gram of carbohydrates precisely. And I feel like many nutritionists kind of increase their salaries that way when they try to sell these concepts.
Sure.
Because
sure.
if you kind of look at the evidence from like 80s or 90s, like scientific studies, you will actually see that pretty much the same recommendations back then as they are these days. The only difference is that these days we kind of try to quantify everything that has been expended on the bike. And then like, we know we have power meters, and then based on the power meters you can guess a pretty good, you can get a pretty good estimate of the energy demands for that training session that you did or you're going to do, whatever way. And then you can quantify how many carbohydrates and how much fat and how much protein you need. So we kind of these days try to probably kind of be really precise in the amounts of carbohydrates and fats and protein we provide to the riders. And some teams go really like to the next step, and like every single gram is counted and things like this. Like my position is that we have a huge error still on the estimation of energy demands, because we have no idea about the energy efficiency on the bike after 7 hours riding outdoors in different environmental conditions. So we are making big guesses still. And even though like, I think, yeah, having an idea of what you consume is really important. I think like kind of, I agree with that. But I think like we are kind of at the point where we're perhaps a bit overcomplicated, and sometimes this brings nutritionists and all these teams to be inflexible because you see like, oh, I don't have any more budget for carbohydrates or any more budget for fats, but the next day it might be a really hard day and you're like, oh, what do I do now? Like, oh no, you're not eating more because you've had enough. But physiology is not like this, you know, like we can't predict how much glycogen you're going to use. I remember doing glycogen depletion sessions, and one day it would be one number, the next day the same participant with the same diet the day before, it would be a different number. So you can't predict these things. So it's kind of, it's good, yeah, we can do more, but at the same time we're also introducing another possibility for errors. What people were doing in the past that was wrong probably was not optimize the immediate post-exercise recovery, not having 120 grams per hour in the last 2 hours of the race, but they only had like 80 because they didn't feel like it, and things like this. Like we now are doing much better than in the past.
Yeah, because I think that the narrative that I'm hearing from a lot of these, like you said, like it's common in the social media sphere, is to hear that like everything is measured and periodized, and it's all about nutrient timing. And I would think that the result of that we would see is like a very optimized body composition. So like, and you would start to see like a consensus in terms of what a lot of athletes would like look like and from the outside in. But if anything, I feel like we have a wider range of appearances and body compositions in terms of athletes being very successful at the top of the sport than I feel like we've ever had. Back in the days of Lance and everything else, everyone looked like they had saran wrap for skin and they were just like extremely lean, right? And after that, I think it got even to a different level. And now it feels like we have a bit more of a balance. So maybe that is the effect though of planning all this out, and it allows athletes to be able to reside at the body composition that allows them to perform best. But it's an interesting topic. And like you said, we might be over measuring and overconfident and all that stuff. Along these lines, I've seen kind of like a discussion, it's like the discussion at first was like 90 grams per hour. We can take in more than 60, and that was the revolutionary thing. And then since then, it's gone up, and we've had Matteo Jorgensen on the podcast talking about how he was taking in 160, and then recently hearing about half distance, like half Ironman triathletes taking in 180 grams per hour on the bike. So then later on, on the run, they can't take in as much. We're hearing about these really high rates. And I feel like I've seen a shift from a lot of people, particularly actually it seems from the scientific research side of things, of people saying, hey, like taking in all this amount can be detrimental. Is there anything bad that you have seen in terms of taking in more than 120 grams per hour? What bad things happen, or why could that potentially be bad for an athlete?
So looking at pretty old studies, I think there are like at least 3 of them out there actually show that if you go too high, you might be increasing the use of muscle glycogen for some reason. We don't know the mechanisms for this, but there is a potential. So if you take in more, it could actually drain muscle glycogen instead of relying on the glycogen that you're getting from taking in carbohydrate through your gut and everything else. So I think the first study was actually by my current boss, Gareth Wallace, and during his PhD with Asker Jokendrup. I think they fed women with 30, 60 or 90 grams of glucose per hour. And 30 and 60, like 30 was suboptimal, 60 seemed to be optimal in terms of like glycogen sparing. But when they went from 60 to 90, the use of glycogen went up, not down. Which is kind of the reverse. Do
you know what happened to fat while that happened?
Yeah, you basically suppress fat oxidation rates, but also increase the glycogen use. And there were, I think, another study from Asker's group showing similar finding. They never like really picked it up. But then a few years ago, I think, I think there was a study from Leeds University, Leeds Beckett, that showed a similar thing, a trend for perhaps a higher glycogen use if you go too high. Whether this is the result of like having gastrointestinal discomfort and perhaps more like kind of stress response from perception like physiology, or is this like a result of basically overfeeding? I'm not sure, and we don't really know. But there is perhaps a chance that like as soon as you probably have gastrointestinal problems, this means you need to reduce the amount of carbs. That's like a safe message we have now. If you're feeling fine with higher intake, then I don't expect like much or many negative problems to occur.
And I guess when we're thinking about that, somebody's probably thinking of this and hearing that and going, well, it'd be great if I was using more of the glycogen that I have stored on board of my muscles. Isn't that the goal? Why would that be a bad thing for cyclists? Can you explain that perspective?
I mean, you're never going to see that the muscle will use, I don't know, the same amount of glucose that you basically, let's say you are able to absorb 60 grams per hour. If the demand for carbohydrates during exercise are 60 grams per hour, it will be only then like 50 or 45 that will come from the ingested carbohydrates, and 15 will still come from the glycogen. And here is kind of the thing that becomes really important for professionals, and I'll try to kind of explain it so that everyone can understand. When you start the exercise, what happens is you probably have relatively high glycogen stores, and the body will preferentially use glycogen stores because when you use glycogen is just near the muscle fibers, so it's like there straight away, immediately available, and also you get more ATP from burning down glycogen than you do from glucose. That's just like basic physiology. But what we know from like really old studies is that once you deplete muscle glycogen stores, you start pretty much relying on the ingested carbohydrates. So you will only see a peak in ingested carbohydrate oxidation rates after like 2.5 hours of exercise. And this is also the point when your muscle glycogen stores will be relatively or very low. And at that point, you will either fatigue or carbohydrates will help you sustain the intensity the carbohydrates you ingest. So having a lot of carbohydrates or maximize carbohydrate availability from ingesting carbohydrates at the end of exercise or late in exercise makes a lot of sense. And I remember like doing the calculations from 90 versus 120 study, I think it came out around 15 watts of a difference. If we keep the fat oxidation rates the same, this difference in availability of carbohydrates can make a big difference. So after like 3, 4, 5 hours, going higher or having maximal carbohydrate availability from just carbs makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So you're trying to spare that, because once you start running out of muscle glycogen, at that point you're purely reliant upon glucose, and then if your gut gets upset or anything else, you're not going to be getting as much glucose into your bloodstream, and as a result, you're going to be even more limited. You kind of like you don't have a lifeline anymore. That lifeboat is gone, so you're just relying upon the main thing. Yeah, that makes sense. Is this so? I think that there's a lot of people that hear this perspective in terms of like everybody's kind of got this goal of going to 120 grams an hour and above. Practically speaking, are you seeing benefit in prescribing that to athletes? You're working with the world's best at Bora Hansgrohe, and then you're also, these days, you're not primarily a cyclist. So, perhaps you follow a different prescription than what you would give to the professionals. But are you finding yourself prescribing over 120 grams with any sort of frequency for athletes, or do you hear of that?
I think it's like we try to individualize the intake, and we kind of have like this idea, and some data will hopefully come out pretty soon, that indicates that perhaps bigger athletes are more likely to be able to ingest or oxidize more of the ingested carbohydrates. So if that's the case, then, like when you're talking about these classics riders, which are like 180, almost 190 meters tall, 120 is basically 80 grams for a 55 kilogram female rider. So you basically need to perhaps like go higher. So I think like we will come to the point that we will scale the recommendations based on the individual characteristics, and testing athletes in the lab to basically determine the rates. You see a large variation. So I know for myself, like I can oxidize like 1.1 gram per minute of glucose per hour, which is like 66 grams. So depending on what ratio I use, then I would go with I could potentially go with like up to 120, and there would be probably no benefit for me to go higher. But I'm sure there are, and I know that there are people that would benefit from going above 120 because they can absorb that.
Yeah, it's interesting, just like anecdotally speaking, if anybody's listening to this, think back to the different experiments you've done with high rates like that. And clearly there's, getting the body used to processing that much, and you kind of have to get past that adaptation curve. But I've certainly found points of diminishing returns where in most cases for me going above like 100, 110, I don't seem to see any sort of additional benefit, and I just run the risk for more potential for gut distress, whereas I typically would be far from that risk and not experience it. Where I go over that, I do start to experience it. You mentioned big athletes. That's a question we've had on the podcast because Nate's so tall, and we've discussed that before. Like, it only makes sense that he would perhaps be able to absorb more, but that's a logical assumption, and logic isn't always scientific. We had Matt Beers on the podcast just recently, multi-time Cape Epic champion and South African champion multiple times over, and he's very tall. I think he's about 6'5", so around like 195 centimeters tall, and with an FTP of around 485. And it only seems just that like an athlete with such a high FTP would be able to take in more, because otherwise, I'm thinking of athletes like Philippe Ogana and other athletes that are known to have very high thresholds. It's got to be a problem that they face where it's just like running out of energy. But then again, both of those athletes seem to do well in that. Have you witnessed that with those, like anecdotally speaking, with larger athletes needing more carbohydrate or perhaps running out of carbohydrate sooner because they just are draining the tank so fast with their large thresholds?
Yeah, and anecdotally speaking, like they kind of feel like, oh yeah, I could have more than 120, whereas a small rider would be like, oh yeah, I was on the limit. So I haven't measured the oxidation rates, but I feel like there could be a potential for them to be able to ingest more. But the thing is also like, I'm kind of not certain that over the duration of your career you can increase the transport capacity for like glucose. You can improve the tolerance, but I don't think you can actually increase the absorption capacity. So once you will match the tolerance with the absorption capacity, going higher will not make any changes anymore. So kind of knowing what the value is makes sense, and this is part of the personalization. I think it's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. And that's a cool thing to measure, when you guys can get to the point of measuring that and see if the absorption rates are indeed changing, right, over time. That would be really cool.
I think for fructose, I think they definitely can change. So if you think about like the gut and what affects what could affect the absorption kinetics is probably like the number of transporters. And basically the best training for transporter is not only to have like during exercise 120 grams per hour or whatever, or like 60 or 90 grams of glucose per hour for 2 hours in a day, but it's basically what you have in the 18 hours or 16 hours when you're awake. So how much carbohydrates you have on a daily basis, because I think that's the more important. So if you have a really low fat, high carbohydrate diet, you are more likely to have upregulated transporters as compared to someone that is on a low carbohydrate diet and only has 50 grams of carbs per day. Mm-hmm. That will be a big difference then. I would imagine. Whereas for fructose, you only get fructose when you eat specific foods, like say sugary items. So depending on how much fructose you have in a like months preceding the test or like the competition, this will probably determine how much you can actually absorb. And then again, this comes down to then sports drinks and stuff, or you're just eating rice which has no fructose, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that's like just a general principle in life, and many times we focus on the narrow when in reality it's the wide and like the negative space where we actually change ourselves more often. Like it's where we spend more time, and we spend less time training than we do just living. And so it makes sense that we would influence how our body works more with a larger amount of time spent. I'm glad you brought up fructose, because that brings up a question a lot of we get from different athletes. First, it was widely said that 2-to-1, a ratio of 2-to-1 for glucose to fructose was ideal. Then it came out that perhaps it was 1 to 0.8. So 1 part glucose for every 0.8 parts of fructose. I may be saying that backwards, but Tim, have you noticed anything that would make you want to go, oh no, 1 is right or 1 is wrong? Or is it variable and different?
We don't really know. So what when they started doing the research in this area, they were like, okay, glucose is absorbed using the one transporter type, and then fructose uses a different transporter type. And once they determined that basically it was probably the absorption limitation of glucose, they said, okay, let's add some fructose and see what's going to happen next. And they were thinking, okay, probably fructose has a less of a capacity for absorption than glucose. So they said the easiest thing is to go 2-to-1 ratio. So the first studies, they were all 2-to-1 ratio, and there was like just studies 2-to-1 ratio, and it was never like determined to be the optimal ratio. Only later, some studies came out from David Rowland's lab in New Zealand that looked at 2-to-1 ratio, 1 to 0.8 ratio, and 1 to 125, so more fructose than glucose. And from there, it kind of evolved that 1 to 0.8 is marginally better. Kind of really small differences, but on an average, it proved to be slightly somehow better than the 2-to-1 or the other one. But I think that given how variable glucose absorption rates are, I would be guessing that there is no one single best ratio, especially because one of the biggest problem is also like we are now looking just carbohydrate absorption rates and purely carbohydrates. But the problem is that you are drinking or eating on the bike, and you also need to think about hydration. And when you're talking about hydration, osmolality, so the number of particles in the solution, become very important. The higher the osmolality, the lower the absorption of water. So from the hydration perspective, you want low osmolality drinks, and this is why we use maltodextrin instead of pure glucose in sports drinks. But the problem with fructose is it's only fructose, so it's basically a monosaccharide that you add. So 1 to 0.8 will always be super sweet and will always have a high osmolality. This means the absorption of water might go down. So we have absolutely no idea whether in the heat perhaps 2-to-1 might be better than 1 to 0.8, because you need to also think from the hydration perspective. It's not just carbohydrates. So I think it's a very complex question, and I don't think it has a clear answer.
That's fascinating. What about the cluster dextrins? I did like a deep dive of sorts into the research that exists on them and everything else, because there's a lot of strong marketing claims that exist around them, being uniquely beneficial over just a standard profile of glucose and fructose. Have you found in your experimentation or perhaps testing, have you found cluster dextrins, and maybe, we can describe what a cluster dextrin is, and then have you found them to be uniquely beneficial?
I think when we try to kind of maximize the carbohydrate availability, and this is what we do in races, you want the carbohydrates that are digested as quickly as possible. And that's why we use maltodextrin with almost like properties as glucose and fructose, because the longer the chains are, the more likely there will be a digestion problem, which means that because you only absorb monosaccharides or glucose or fructose, so the more branch chain you have, the higher the likelihood that there will be a limitation in how quickly you can break down the bonds and get to the monosaccharides. So from like performance perspective and maximizing the carbohydrate availability, I would argue that there is absolutely no evidence that going with any kind of anything else but maltodextrin and fructose would make a lot of sense. But equally, we know that when you go for a really long ride, 6 hours low intensity or 5 hours low intensity, and when you don't want to go with super high carbohydrate intakes because, there is no demand for these amounts of carbohydrates, you want a sustainable release of carbohydrates. Like I see it myself when I train quite often. Like I go for a ride 5 hours on the weekend, and I have these gels that are 45 grams of carbohydrates. And what happens is that I take one gel, and then towards the end of the ride, like after 3 hours when my glycogen stores are pretty much empty, after 40 minutes after having a gel, I will feel like I need another one, because the carbohydrates will be absorbed by then, and there will be nothing coming into the system anymore. So I have a problem. What do I do for the last 15 minutes of an hour if my goal is to have 45 grams per hour? Whereas if I had a slower carbohydrate release product, then it would make sense because, it will last me for an hour. So I think there is like kind of a space for these kind of sustainable release carbohydrates, and it's not just cluster dextrin, it's also like palatinose, or that comes from Germany, which is kind of a slow release glucose to fructose source, which can be really good for like low intensity endurance rides, but definitely not for high performance.
Yeah, so it's all just like understanding the tools that we need for the different situation. I want to talk more about the pro team side of things now, if you're able. And I know that there's probably a lot of things you probably can't share, right? Because you don't want to leak competitive advantages to the other teams. But at the same time, I do want to see it. There's this narrative so we see amateurs catching up to professionals in terms of how many carbs they're taking in. But there's also a narrative that exists that the pro peloton itself is pretty far behind in terms of how many carbs they should take in, and that it's playing catch up. And like now, one of the reasons why we're seeing such great performances across the board is because everybody is taking in more carbs. Have you seen a change over the last couple of years in terms of it being more acceptable to take in high carbohydrate amounts, or was it always accepted and people were always willing to do it?
No. This is definitely a new thing, because like when you work with older riders, it's kind of, you need a lot of explanations and a lot of discussions with them to basically make them have more carbohydrates. Whereas the young riders would be like, oh, let's go with 120 for pretty much every single ride. And it would be like sometimes even like you say, okay, 90 is enough, like you're just doing an endurance ride, and he would come back and would say, no, I need 120 because it just can't live without having 120. Whereas I know that physiologically this doesn't make any sense, but it's just the perception and just this idea how important fueling is these days. So I think there is a big change, and having worked with some of the best riders, some would go like with really low rates on endurance rides, and some would still go really high. And I think like the younger that you are, the more carbs you will have on endurance rides.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Its relationship to its age, tied to age and experience. There's like I mean, the whole it was popularly known, like eating is cheating was like a thing that you had heard many times and people didn't take in as much. Is there, for these athletes that are that want to take in a ton during those easier rides, how do you balance that with getting them used to taking in high carbohydrates? Because it sounds like your advocation is to not take in as much when you're doing those lower intensity rides. So how do you get them to the point where they're taking in more carbohydrate for the race? Do you ever ramp them up with those lower intensity rides so they get used to 120 grams? Or is it only during the intense sessions do you prescribe higher amounts?
Yeah, I kind of like to do both. So as I mentioned earlier, like I think gradual increase in carbohydrate intake over like 5-6 hour long ride makes a lot of sense. So you start the ride with like first hour, perhaps you don't need even any carbohydrates because like you have the glycogen, and then as the ride progresses and you're doing 240, 250 watts on average, what professionals are doing, after 5 hours you have a big kind of lack of energy, and at that point, well, having 120 grams per hour will not suppress fat oxidation rates, will not do anything, but will help you first train the gut, and secondly, it will help with the recovery for the next day. So I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of gradually increase, and even in like long endurance rides, get to really high rates towards the end. And obviously, like when the intensity is high, then you also go high from the start. So you just kind of play around a bit.
Yeah. Have there been any observations that you've had in working with pro teams that have contrasted with the observations or things that you've seen in the lab? In the sense that like, have you kind of been like, I thought that this is how this worked, but I see these athletes doing something different. And whether it's correct or not is just but decoupling, I guess, from what you've seen in the lab to what you see in practice.
I mean, there are always some specific cases, like, I don't know, let's say some riders would be really focused on protein, and when you know from the lab that protein is not as important as it's like carbohydrate balance, or like this obsession about the body mass in professional cycling is like it's sometimes a bit like too much. When you're there like, oh yeah, I'm like empty of glycogen if I have a low body mass, or I'm full of glycogen and the body mass overnight goes up, which is not how these things work. But I still think kind of like in studies, it's still like how it is, and it's still like, I don't know, we tested one rider once in the lab for something because everyone thought he was special or it was something special, and then it was like textbook number that came out, and I was like, well, you know, like they're not as special, they're just like special at recovering, but like the normal physiology, the processes are still the same, so nothing changes. They're as efficient as normal people. Their efficiency is not 30%, it's still 23 or 24% on the bike, so everything still stands. But yeah, you hear a lot of these kind of feelings from the riders or like perceptions that they are somehow special.
Yeah. Have you seen the usage of ketones change? For a while there, it was like this, it was almost implied that it was this like secret amongst the peloton that they were taking in ketones. It was never illegal, so I'm not sure why it was like a secret. And it seemed like it was the thing that everyone was talking about for a short period of time. It seems like the research that has been published, like when you consider the body of research, it seems like there's a much more tempered attitude toward ketones being performance enhancing for athletes. So have you seen it? Was it really high and has it dropped off, or have you seen any change in perception amongst the pro peloton?
Yeah, I think it's not as big as it used to be. Because like for some time it was probably like everyone was like, oh, they have ketones in that team, like I want ketones as well. There are still some riders that use ketones and I believe in them, and you don't want to take them away. But probably like majority of the riders are not using ketones these days, except for the teams that are sponsored. And even in those teams, there are riders that are not using them because they don't believe that they do anything and then taste horrible. So I think they still kind of try to portray ketones as something special, but I don't really think that there is a lot of evidence, because those studies that show benefits were designed to like overtrain people or like which is not what happens in real life scenario. Or for professional athletes, we know that like very small number of supplements works in the first place because all the adaptations are like so maximized that you really can't increase, I don't know, capillary density even further. Whereas in amateur athletes, any kind of training and any kind of intervention usually works. So you can't really mix these things together. And yeah, I think you kind of, with ketones and these kind of supplements, you kind of lose focus. So instead of like focusing on getting the recovery in the carbohydrate as quickly as possible after the stage, if you tell the rider, oh, you're going to recover really well with ketones, and he just takes ketones and then skips the carbohydrates, and then, oh, we have a problem here. So, yeah.
Yeah. Have you, I was recently with a rider who was part of the Postal Service team back in the day and everything else, and a comment was made that they said that they don't ever remember seeing sweat stains on the best athletes in the world. And there was a discussion ensued thereafter that athletes these days, I would assume, are taking in much more sodium than they used to because of awareness of it, because of products that exist, everything else like that. And there's this assumption that from this athlete's side that like, oh, well, top athletes are just like the best athletes are naturally optimized in the sense that they would never be showing sweat stains or anything else like that, but rather they retain everything that they need and everything else like that. I guess that my question is, from your perspective of helping pro tour athletes, and I know that sodium isn't your field of study, but from your perspective of helping pro tour athletes and also being an amateur athlete and knowing of the experience of amateur athletes, do you feel like all of us are consuming too much sodium? Is that why there's, salt stains are so prevalent on everybody's kit these days and we're taking in too much? Or is that just the fact that we're taking in enough to be able to offset losses and that's just a natural consequence of it?
Yeah, like looking at the evidence again, like we know that for exercise, it's like shorter than 4 hours. You don't really need to replace the sodium during exercise. You have enough stored in the body. I think for like top level performance, it makes sense to replace some of it, but don't go like over too high. For triathletes, I think it makes sense because it's like still much longer than 4 hours. And I think these messages then get mixed, and the manufacturers just make one product with a lot of salt and sell it as like, oh, this is like what you need to have. And then perhaps you overload with sodium professional riders, and then you see a lot of stains. And the body adapts really quickly with the sweat. So for instance, if you have sodium bicarbonate, which is sodium, most of it, 3 hours or 1 hour, whatever, before the race, you will see much more salt already on your body. And the use of sodium bicarbonate has increased in the last few years. So I think this is part of the reason why we see more of this. But equally, I think some doctors and even athletes are too concerned about rehydration and the importance of electrolytes. So they have a lot of electrolytes during the race, and then electrolytes after, and electrolytes in the morning, and then just like electrolytes everywhere. Whereas we know that with heat acclimation, you basically reduce the requirements for electrolytes because you sweat less of them. But still, if you have so many in the diet, the sweat rates, the rates of sodium in the sweat will go up. So I think we are overcomplicating here a bit. And recently, there are teams that are not using sodium in the recovery, just on the bike. And there are teams that are not using sodium on the bike, but just in recovery to basically minimize the sodium.
Yeah. And I mean, if you take in too much sodium, that can complicate digestion, right, on the bike. Like if you take in a ton on the bike, is that the thing that they're trying to avoid there?
Everyone is concerned about the morning body weight. That's the most important thing. So in the morning, you basically have 500 grams too much because of water retention, everyone will be like, oh yeah, I'm too heavy for today, like I can't climb, even though it's water, and this water will be
used.
And you will just, it's actually beneficial, but that's not how people see it. So from that perspective, I think it's a bit, it amuses me a bit.
I'm sure. On the sodium bicarbonate side, I want to ask you about two more supplements before we finish here. On the sodium bicarbonate side, that was the other thing I was going to ask. We've seen that Marten has their product that makes it, with the claim that it makes it easier to ingest than just taking in, powder itself. And for what it's worth, anecdotally speaking, with myself and the 3 other employees here at TrainerRoad, we performed a very informal study of sorts where we tested this, and all of them did find it easier to consume, but no less, still not a pleasant experience to consume it. Is that something that like our athletes just taking spoonfuls of sodium bicarbonate or mixing it into their drink? And is that a common thing now across the board? Because the narrative for a while, it was like, if you're doing an hour record, you would want to take in something like sodium bicarbonate or a similar effort like that. But is it becoming commonplace during all the stages or during races for all the athletes on a team to be taking in sodium bicarbonate, regardless of how they're taking it in?
Yeah, especially for the classics, probably. It's kind of very popular, and I would say that most teams are actually using sodium bicarbonate these days. First, like from the past, like they were using the powder, now everyone is using the pills or the Morten bicarb. And pills can be like normal or enteric coated, and I think enteric coated pills would behave very similarly to Morten bicarb in terms of like GI discomfort and things like that. So we are far away from having the powder, which is, that's horrible. Yeah. But I think even in training there is evidence it can help with training adaptation. So I think there is more and more use. The problem is that you kind of can overload with sodium, and then you might experience headaches and things like that, which you need to be kind of careful about, because that's probably raised blood pressure. So you can't do it like every single day and every stage, but you need to kind of, for a grand tour, you decide which days you want to go with, and then you go with it.
Yeah, it seems like the higher intensity sort of efforts are key with that sort of thing, right? Yeah. Okay, last one I want to ask about is caffeine. How is caffeine leveraged in like a nutrition strategy for World Tour athletes? Like I've heard crazy things of like 400 to 600 milligrams of caffeine being taken toward the end, like, in the final bottles toward the end of a stage. And it seems like a crazy amount. Not only that, but I feel like it would take too long to get into the system and to actually see that sort of benefit. But is it leveraged to those really high amounts, and is that common? Or is this something that you don't hear about as much, and it's just a myth from the outside in?
I think it's still like it is possible, and I think it's very individual. So with caffeine, you kind of individualize the intake, and like some riders would just be fine with just having a gel with like 75 milligrams of caffeine, and rely on that. Some others would want some like caffeine booster in a liquid form with like 150 or 300 milligrams, and some might take pills with, to me, unknown quantities, because that would be like the decision would be made by them last minute. So I think everyone has his own perspective or view on caffeine, and I don't think there is a rule for everyone, because we see that caffeine is very like individual, not only from like how much they can consume outside the competition, but also like how they process caffeine, how quickly it goes out of the system. And I think there are like lots of different types of questions that like I don't really have expertise to answer, but I always ask a rider like, how do you feel about it, like why do you usually do, and then try to improve the timing or things like that, depending on when the rider's tasks are in the race, because not everyone is going for the last climb. Some riders pretty much finish the race after first 2 hours, so you kind of want to time it perfectly, and you can help the rider with that. But I usually try not to make a revolution in caffeine intake with the riders.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Dr. Podlogar, thanks so much for joining me and recording this podcast. It's awesome to have you on. It's exciting to see your athletes, always the Bora athletes, and I'm always like cheering for them because of the connection to you, and I appreciate your work so much and everything you share. If athletes want to get to know more about Dr. Podlogar, they can follow you on Instagram, right? And is there anything else they could do to get in touch? I don't know if there's ways they can support your research or anything else.
No, at the moment it's just Instagram. But because perhaps we come up with something in my next post, but that will come in October. But
cool. Awesome. Well, great. Tim, thanks so much. And we'll chat soon. And thanks everybody for listening. Take care.
Thanks for having me.